Human rights advocates have urged parties at COP27 to increase recognition and protection of environmental and land defenders. Environmental human rights defenders face danger and sometimes even death for their tireless work protecting the environment. According to Global Witness, more than 1,700 murders of environmental activists were recorded over the past decade, an average of a killing nearly every 2 days. Now let's discuss this. We are now joined via Zoom by Katherine Robinson, Natural Justice Head of Campaigns. Katherine, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. Now, one would think that activists would at least be protected at all costs, just given the work that they do. But according to this new report, more than 1,700 murders of environmental activists were recorded over the past decade. Talk to us about, some of these attacks and what can be done to prevent them.
Thanks, Anati. The attacks on environmental defenders, land defenders, indigenous peoples and local communities are certainly on the uptick, to the point where we're seeing an average of one environmental defender killed across the world every 2 days. And that's at the end of the spectrum where, that results in assassination. But there are multiple other forms of repression and reprisals against environmental and land defenders. And these range from intimidation, surveillance, attacks, evictions, slap suits, and attempts by governments and corporations to use the judicial system to undermine the rights and perspectives of environmental defenders. Ultimately, this is a punitive approach that's taken by state actors and corporates when defenders are ultimately defending their land, their livelihood, their constitutional rights ultimately. And this is a threat not only to the land and environmental defenders themselves. It's not only a threat to the guardians, the primary guardians of our biodiversity, the primary guardians of our land, the guardians of ultimately our sea, our soil, our seeds. These are the people who are not only defending themselves and their land, but they're defending us and they're defending future generations. So when you have these reprisals and attacks and assassinations, it's ultimately, a threat to our democracy. It's a threat to our constitutional rights, and it's a closure of civic space. And what we can do to try and prevent this, I think in the long term, we need a serious overhaul of our system, which puts profit before people and the environment. But in the interim, we need to ensure we're amplifying defenders' struggles and perspectives and solutions, like you're doing here on the SABC. At multilateral processes like COP27, we need intense advocacy to ensure that our governments are protecting and putting in progressive language and safeguards in the negotiations and in the documents. And in the interim, emergency funds, Natural Justice has the African Environmental Defenders Fund. This is a way for environmental defenders to access recourse to justice, to litigation, to legal support, and to funding. But ultimately, we need national and international solidarity to defend defenders.
In the previous package that we've just read, we were talking about African scientists believing that they are ready to provide scientific evidence of the impact and damage of climate change. Now, just in terms of our conversation, is there a link between, the climate crisis and the growing violence against land and environmental defenders?
Absolutely. We can see it ourselves as we've seen an increase in climate-induced disasters across the world. When you look at the science and the reports that are coming out from Global Witness and the African Environmental Defenders Fund, there's definitely an uptick of reprisals against land and environmental defenders and indigenous peoples. But not only that, as the crisis worsens, the violence increases because, one, environmental and land defenders are resisting the lip service that's been given to them by governments and by corporations who are ultimately greenwashing their attempts to advance climate mitigation and ambition. So their resistance is intensifying, as does the reprisals because of that resistance and because they're speaking up against false solutions that are offered, like carbon capture mechanisms, biofuels, conservation. These are all false solutions offered up by corporates and governments which ultimately further threaten and deepen the threats that local communities and indigenous peoples face to their land and livelihoods. And then on top of that, climate-induced loss and damage and climate-induced biodiversity loss, this together with reprisals creates a systemic form of violence. And this is ultimately an egregious violation of defenders and land defenders and environmental defenders, civic and participatory rights, economic, social, and cultural rights, and ultimately a right to their self-determination.
Now, Katherine, of course, you already in Egypt at the COP17. What will your call be, to those in power about putting a stop to the assassinations of land defenders, and particularly if we start looking at, the importance of the role indigenous communities play in as far as climate action is concerned?
Our biggest demand. So this year, this coming week, governments will be negotiating an action plan on climate empowerment, which is this presents a historic opportunity for governments and states to ensure there's progressive language in those negotiations, and there's specific references to the safeguarding of environmental and land defenders, indigenous peoples, and local communities. So that is going to be our main ask. And as governments and states also reflect upon their progress towards implementing the Paris Climate Agreement through the global stocktake, this again is an opportunity for governments to take stock of how have they protected environmental and land defenders, and what are the gaps, and what can they do now and in the coming years to ensure that their rights and their lives are safeguarded. And ultimately, I think it requires political will from governments. They need to understand that for us to achieve climate justice and for us to achieve a just energy transition, or a just transition both in the agricultural and energy sector, it has to center local communities, indigenous communities, workers, and people on the front lines of the climate crisis. Without protecting those on the front lines of the climate crisis, we're never going to achieve energy justice. We're never going to achieve climate justice. And this is why their voices, perspectives, struggles, and solutions are absolutely critical at the COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh.
All right, Katherine, thank you so much for that analysis. Of course, Katherine Robinson is the Natural Justice Head of Campaigns, just talking to us there ahead of COP27.